Mm. Is anyone there? Okay, so we're just gonna give people a few minutes to show up, and then we'll get started going over the assignment. And after that, I'll answer any lingering questions. Okay, with the grand total of 16 people watching, it seems like a good time and any to get started. I'm going to start just giving a general overview of the assignment 3, the different parts, general problem areas, and then I figure whoever has questions can just ask them in chat, and I may address some questions from the Piazza if any are unresolved. Okay, let's get started. So this assignment focuses on probability, more specifically using Bayesian network to simulate complex systems. We use a library called PBNT to represent these Bayesian networks. It's a little dated and we're hoping to replace it soon, but it's what we have. So for the whole first part of the assignment, we're basically just having you construct a simple Bayesian network to basically get you used to using this library to construct nodes and to link them together and to set them probability, and then to be able to use the library to calculate the probability of certain states of this Bayesian network. You've probably seen this before. I believe it's either in the books or the lecture or both. There's basically an alarm at a nuclear power plant. It's dependent on temperature, but the gauge that reads the temperature can be faulty, and the alarm can also be faulty, and all of these different nodes in this network interact with each other and affect the probabilities. So part 1A, you're basically just creating the nodes for each of these, and you're adding the parent nodes, the nodes that they're dependent on, and the child nodes that are dependent on them. This is pretty straightforward, so I don't have much to say about this. Yeah, okay, after that, you're basically just adding the probabilities to the network. For the nodes that are independent of other nodes, it'll be a discrete distribution, and that'll just basically be the probability of it being true and the probability of it being false. Otherwise, it'll be this more complicated conditional discrete distribution, where you basically feed in the nodes that it's dependent on, and then it's a more complicated table you're constructing. And this probability table is a NumPy array rather, where different probabilities of something being true is different based on different states of the nodes that it's dependent on. And this is basically a very simple one, that there are 2 parent nodes and all of these are in true false states, so it's a little simpler than we'll see later on. And basically, we do this section so you get a feel for that and a feel for constructing and navigating these tables for when we give you a more complicated Bayesian network in part 2. After this, you're basically just using the built-in magic of the Bayesian network library to calculate the marginal probability of different node states given other different node states. The code to do that is here. You can also find additional documentation. If it's not linked here, then just PBNT docs, I'm sure would find it. And this is pretty simple. You can actually calculate this by hand using the probability techniques and rules that are discussed in the probability lectures as well as the Bayesian network lectures. And basically, you can do that to double check the value, but we also give you the value. So I guess it's mostly if you don't trust us, which we grade the work, so I'd trust us in that regard. So part 2 is sampling. This is basically the meat of the assignment. This is where most of your work will be or has been at this point probably. This basically expands the network we use in this example, basically expands Bayesian networks beyond nodes with simple true-false states. There are basically 2 types of nodes here. There are the team nodes, and then there are the MATS nodes. So there are 3 teams, and each has a different skill level. I believe the skill level ranges from 0 to 3, and they're basically it's a round robin. So each team faces each other team. So A faces B, B faces C, and then C faces A. And the chance that the first team will win or the second team will win is basically dependent on the difference between the skill levels, which you'll see in this table here. So the first part is you basically want to build this network. And to do that, you have to think about how to expand the concept of probability tables beyond simple this gauge is faulty or it's not faulty. So you have to expand it out to having more than 2 states. So for the skill level, it'll have 4 states. And the outcome table, it'll have 3 different states. The first team wins, the second team wins, or it's a tie. So that's basically the building part of it. And after that, we want you to calculate the posterior distribution for the B versus C match. In the calculate posterior, you can use the enumeration engine here. This is somewhat similar to 1C. I believe this uses the junction tree, but largely on your side of the approach, you can basically just plug and play the different engines in. So we're just having you use a different engine here. Yeah, and we give you some code snippets in order to access the node's probability distribution directly. And yeah. So I'm going to move on to sampling in general. So sampling is basically used when it's either very hard or very time consuming to calculate by hand or by inference the probabilities of certain states. For example, if you wanted to get the marginal for all of the states, I believe that's a instance where sampling would be helpful. We have you implement 2 sampling algorithms here, Gibbs sampling and Metopoulos-Hastings sampling. Both you're basically given a class that takes a network and a state value as a parameter, and you basically want to return a single sample from that sampler. So Gibbs will only differ by one variable, or it won't differ at all. While Metropolis Hastings, from what I remember, you will basically be resampling all of the variables at once. Yeah, and then Metropolis Hastings also has the concept of what is it called? An acceptance function, which basically determines if a sample that's generated is likely enough to be considered or if it's just wildly off base. Yeah, and once you implement both of those, you will want to compare them. You can either do this on your own, like by running tests and running repeated iterations of both sampling methods and test how long they take to converge, or you can also call them directly from your code and then programmatically determine the results you're returning. And we basically just have a number of things here. And for sampling and TUI in specific, there's a number of parameters that you will probably find helpful to modify. We talk about the concept of a burn-in parameter, which is basically a number of samples that you're generating for each sampling method before you even consider samples. So you would basically just throw those samples away completely, and it would basically just be calculating samples for the process of warming up a sampling engine and getting it to the state where it's generating samples that are more likely to be realistic given the Bayesian network you're basing on. You can also change things like the maximum difference between samples that's acceptable for convergence. We talk about 0.001, but you're free to change that. And you're also free to just change the number of consecutive estimates that have to be this value or less in their difference. When I did this assignment in the spring, I found myself experimenting with all three to basically find the right match to get my sampling converging as it should. Lastly, we have you return your name just for fun. So remember to do that, or don't. Okay, so that's it for the general overview. If people want to ask questions in live chat, which should be to the right of your screen. I see some people have talked in it already. Feel free to ask questions, and then I'll try my best to answer them. Okay, so we have our first question about part A, 1A. Just the phone. So the faulty gauge affects the gauge directly. The gauge then affects whether the probability of the alarm going off, but there's no direct link between the faulty gauge and the alarm. Hopefully that answers your question. And yes, that's the same for faulty alarm affecting alarm. Both of the faulty nodes only affect whatever they're supposed to directly, Any other effects are just farther down the chain. So I'm checking on Chris's question now for part 2C. So I'm not sure I quite understand it directly. You're not computing samples of a given probability. You're computing samples with fixed evidence for the and I believe there's some. There we go. So the only thing given is that A beats B and A draws with C. So those variables should be fixed. Those states should be fixed. Or you should reject states that don't have those correctly. Yeah, Chris, if you could like restate your question, because I feel like I've not answered it. Full disclosure. I would appreciate it because I don't understand really the connection between samples and a specific probability value. We check the probability values of certain things based on the samples you generate, but you're not really generating samples of a specific probability value. Okay, so Moon's question is for part 2C, how do we use the table to calculate the probabilities without using the inference engine? This is a good question. We give a number of resources, by the way. At least we used to. It might be on T-Square for the resources folder that had some additional I want to avoid saying the word resources, but sources for things like GIB sampling that you can use to work this out. Like this paper that's linked in the description is pretty helpful. Give me just a second to refresh myself. Okay, so basically, for the probabilities you're calculating for GIB sampling, you'll want to base it on the root probability distribution tables you have and manipulating them. You're not allowed to use the inference engine, so if you have to find out the probability of a certain match outcome based on certain teams having certain skill levels, you have to calculate that yourself using those tables. And you'll basically just have to use the portion you've already sampled or that you're given in the initial state to figure out those probabilities. Okay, the resources are in the PDF. That's a good point. And yes, Lucindy, I apologize if I mangled that, but the temperature affects both the gauge and the chance that the gauge is faulty. But yes, because I did not state it clearly, the PDF in the GitHub repo, while the section of it that's on the actual assignment is woefully dated, the PDF will have a lot of helpful links to other resources that will help you, particularly with sampling, because this is a difficult topic at times. So if you don't understand it in the book or you don't understand it in the lecture, it might be worth trying a different resource. Okay, any remaining questions from the live chat? So Chris, I see a question again, and I kind of get where you're going at. You will, I believe, use the different probabilities of things given the evidence variables to calculate the possibility of different states to sample from them. I guess I'm confused by your nomenclature because you're not given B and C in terms of the fixed evidence. You may be talking about the state you're sampling from in the state of Gibbs, which would make more sense, but yeah, and then that would make more sense because that would be the Markov blanket of, or if not, it would be the direct dependence of B versus C. So yeah, that's largely what you're doing. The specific implementation will vary depending on the node that you have to sample. And you want to basically be careful when it comes to that you're considering all of the nodes that you need to consider. So you should look into the Markov blanket section in the lectures, and they'll go into that a lot. And hopefully that's a better answer to your question, because I know I flipped it a bit the first time. I believe there was a question. Proposal distance. MWIC are questions about the proposal distribution and the resampling of a particular variable. Could you restate that a bit? Because I can't see what your actual question is. I don't know if you didn't get to it or. Okay, so your question is how we sample. That's kind of a big question since it's kind of the entire second section largely. I will find some time to go to your specific Piazza post, because otherwise it's a good old general. Yeah, I can see your question here. Um, okay. Okay, so this is, I looked over your Piazza post, which, as you mentioned in the chat, is 622 if anyone else wants to take a look from it. Um, I don't have a simple answer for you here because taking the resources and figuring out how to apply them to discrete is a large part of the assignment. I mentioned in an earlier uh, answer that Markov blankets are somewhat important here. So you're not just looping over the entire space needlessly when performing inference for the probabilities. And that'll basically make it so it's a little more doable. Otherwise, it's complexly a little bit too much. And I'm going to take a second to look over some prior resources to basically have a more comprehensive answer real quick. Um, To refresh my memory, are the discussion in chat going on right now? Is that about Gibbs or about MH sampling? Okay, so yeah, it's for Gibbs that the Markov blanket is pretty important. You want to sample from the dependent nodes. Um, and then from there, you basically want to use the, sorry, I feel like I'm getting tuned out at this point. Um, okay, yes, I see Stephen Johnson is talking about the um, children, parents, and parents of children, which is the Markov blanket. And basically, once you have those fixed, either through sampling or through initial state, it makes calculating the probabilities for sampling a lot easier. I'm guessing in the chat there were some questions I um, did not get to. If anyone has them, please feel free to point them out, and then I can get to them and try to keep my mind straight between Gibbs and M8s, because even us TAs get confused sometimes. I think, Chris, I finally get what you're talking about. When you talk about summing the probabilities, are you doing that in order to normalize the probabilities so you can choose from them using the mp.random.choice? Yeah, so that would be one approach to it. It's not the traditional approach. Traditionally, you just take the time to normalize and it simplifies your math a little. But if you don't want to normalize, in theory, that should work. So that would be the approach, at least. Um, Stephen, when you're talking about P0, P1, P2, P3, are you talking about the probability of different skill levels for the teams, rather, in terms of how to sample from them? Yeah, so this is similar in a way, because if you remember, the Markov blanket includes, oh, it's just up here. It includes the children, it includes the parents. Um, and the parents of other children. So in that respect, you basically, if you're calculating, say, a team node, you need to look at all of those. It won't have parents, obviously, but you need to look at the other corresponding parts of a Markov blanket. And you basically need to aggregate those probabilities according to probability rules. And then from there, you can accurately sample a new skill level for that team, if that makes sense. Okay. Unless there are any more live chat questions, I'm thinking I'll wind this down now. I'll be going through Piazza soon and trying to answer any lingering questions. Oh, Chris is asking how you all use the samples you get. You largely don't. The major part of it is just to pass on the samples. For compare samplers, that will basically be the only place you'll actually be using the samples you generate. And you'll basically want to do your own, if you're doing it programmatically, you'll want to do your own, your basically analysis of how long it takes to converge by testing if it converges and how quickly it happens between the two different algorithms. I'll retract my earlier statement a bit. You will use your samples in M8 sampling, because you basically need to compare them against the acceptance function to see whether it's passed on or not. But otherwise, you won't use the samples directly. And yes, Stephen, that's largely correct. It will basically be P0 given the Markov blanket of existing evidence, P1 given the Markov blanket, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can use mp.random.choice to, using the probability table you're able to generate to randomly select a new state with the correct probability for each possibility. Basically, for Gibbs, the idea is as you generate more and more samples, the probability of a certain state in those samples, which you can do by taking the number of samples you've collected so far and then checking how often a certain state happens, comparing them as it changes. The idea is that the more and more samples you generate, the more accurate your estimates of the posterior will be. So over time, if you're doing the sampling correctly, the idea is that it will converge. So most of it comes down to testing if it's converged, which you basically just do by doing repeated estimates of the posterior probability of something, and then seeing if that has basically gotten down to a reasonable value. And by down to a reasonable value, the amount of changes between samples is a reasonable value. And part of that will just be the accumulation of samples. And the other half is doing sampling correctly, which is the harder part, obviously. So the samples will change. They most likely will. It actually depends a little on your specific implementation and the algorithm. But basically, you want to process these samples by, for example, M. Baker is talking about the 3 different values for BVC. And once you do that, you can use the generated samples to calculate the probability for a win or tie or lose on that node. And those are the values actually that you don't want to be changing between samples once you've reached convergence, because basically you've accumulated enough samples that are like your sampling is consistent enough for some combination of both that that value is set and constant and consistent. And yes, Baker, that sounds logically correct. And there are different ways to do the specific transformation of the samples you have into the posterior probabilities. But what's important is that you're doing some sort of transformation or calculation. And based on that, you can test for convergence. So Chris, I want to correct you there. Other nodes will change in the samples you're generating. You're just only really testing on that specific node. Yeah, and you can see it in 2E where it talks about the estimating the likelihood of different outcomes for the third match. So it is important that those other nodes will change values as you sample, because the entire concept of a Bayesian network is other node states will affect the probability of that node state. But you only really, when calculating it, you only really have to care about the outcome of that BVC node. And you can use that to calculate probabilities, if that makes sense. Okay, and assuming that answers Chris's question, I think that'll be the ending point for today. So I'll likely see you all on Piazza. I'll also put on in the OMSC study Slack channel, depending on availability, the best way to reach TA in general. I'll see you guys later. Reach out to me if you have any lingering questions. And it was great to have this. You're all very patient with me fumbling around, so I appreciate that. Good luck on the assignment all.